The next generation of consumers, my folks, are the architects of consumer choice, and they cannot be told what they can and can't do with their money. And they're going to be super engaged in making sure that the providers are focused on the things that they love. Can't afford to subsidize people who don't need subsidies, and those people are not going to enjoy a homogenous, heavily subsidized and rationed service. That's also so exciting. It has to break now. It's got to change now.
Yeah, maybe just tell us a little bit about your journey into aged care and how that's kind of grown into your own business.
I've been in aged care, 25, nearly 30 years now. So I started life as a young accountant, not a good accountant. So I quickly tried to find ways of getting out of it. And my passions at the time were working with Indigenous people, working overseas for the World Bank and AusAid. And shortly after that was working in aged care. So that was sort of in an accounting environment. And within that accounting environment with Grant Thornton, we got to the point where really we needed to have a team that were broader than bean counters. And so we started to look at options to bring on nurses. We started Ansell Strategic just over a decade ago, and that team then sort of grew to teams that are property experts and bean counters like me and nurses, operational specialists. And so that's basically what we've evolved into. Most of our stuff is around helping people build stuff, feasibility studies around retirement villages and nursing homes in New Zealand and Australia, making things nicer to live in, nicer to work in, and more financially viable. And then, of course, we do the mergers and acquisition stuff on some of the small and larger transactions for people that want to grow or people that want to go. So that's been my journey so far. I think the next 10 years is the most exciting. So that's really what you and I have talked about for many years.
Yeah, absolutely. And as your own business has grown, because I know you guys do a lot of varied services. When I say I look up to you, that's something I look up to you. I think the expertise you've got is across a number of areas, and I know you deal with selling and buying and things like that. So what do some of those interactions look like between Ansell Strategic and providers out there?
I suppose we cover the sort of cradle to grave service offering because we only do aged care and retirement living. So we're a bit sort of focused. We don't do disability or general consulting services. So we're very just focused on aged care. And the beauty of that means that we can be one-on-one with clients. We are sort of people who have worked in aged care on the ground. So our nurses are spread around Australia and New Zealand as we speak today, and they're on the ground with aged care providers. So we kind of are lucky to get that sort of unique feel of working with the sort of head office and executive, which is sort of more of my life. And then the consultants and the nurses spend a lot of time on the floor within nursing homes and home care businesses and retirement living. And we then can sort of collaborate and bridge that gap between the overall management of services and what's happening on the ground. And I don't get as much time as I'd like to be at the front line as I used to, but having the team come together and let me know how it's working and what the experience is for residents and staff is just invaluable.
How have you seen that change over time, Cam, as your career's grown and your company's grown? Yeah, how have those service offerings changed? And I know there's new data available, and as we said, there's so much happening out there. So how are you guys kind of leveraging that and using that? Like what opportunities are out there at the moment for you guys?
Yeah, I suppose if you look at it over time, to be honest, I think the last sort of since 2016, it's been a little bit more of a survival focus. A lot of change, funding cuts in 2016, had a slowdown then in capital developments, which was really a key part for us, which has only just started to creep in again. And then we had COVID, we had a Royal Commission, a whole bunch of things that really had us sort of stay still. The performance of the sector obviously has made it very difficult for people to innovate and do things differently. But then over the last 6 months, I think we've seen that the level of reform, the level of change that our customers are having to deal with is starting to plateau a little bit. I think some of the adjustments to funding are putting us in slightly more even keel. And I think there are some mechanisms that have been built into the reform program that should give us some confidence that we're not going to allow that slippage to take place too much without it being easy for us to make it public. So I actually think it's really great timing. We're not going to meet the sort of targets that we had in terms of development of services in preparation for the baby boomers. But I think in some ways that's going to force a really accelerated level of change over the next 10 years. And while we kind of look at where the baby boomers peak in the 40s, actually the most exciting time is the next 10 years, because this is the bit post World War II where that really spiky part of demand comes up, and everything that we do now in the next 10 years is going to be influential on all of the baby boomer support that we provide, and then my generation, and then you after me, Adam, to follow. So it's this next 10 years, which is the most exciting. And for us, having our clients move away from just survival and doing the same services into innovation and really thinking about what do they reckon the future looks like, what's the bit they want to be in, and how do they get to that point. That's what I reckon is really exciting about right now.
Hi, Cam. It's a privilege to have you on the show. You just mentioned baby boomers there, and I recently watched your talk at the Leaders Summit, the ostrich talk, and you opened it up in a very compelling way where you said that this might offend people. And I immediately reached for the volume knob because I think these are the things we need to discuss, particularly when you say that the wealthiest demographic is about to go into aged care. They have cash and assets, which means they have choice. And as you say, nothing drives quality like people spending their own money. So do you think that that choice will become a competition-driven, maybe open up the marketplace a little bit and see things shift that way?
Absolutely, no question, Danny. And you're right. I do like to say that, I hope it will offend. And I like to say also, because we have, a lot of belief in what we think the world will look like in 2035, but by shocking people and offending them, I think it brings people bringing their own views of what they think it will look like in the future. And I know our projections will be wrong, because we got them wrong 20 years ago. The world looks different today than we projected them 10 years ago. Where we are at the moment, we approach with much more certainty. And the reason for that is we were looking for or hoping for smart policy decisions over the last 2 decades. The first intergenerational report from Costello really said, look, guys, we can't keep doing it like this. We're a lucky country. I think at that time, about 0.6% of GDP was being spent on aged care, and we could afford to, subsidize people who didn't need to be subsidized. 20 years later, nothing changed very much. And so we're now in a situation where we have a somewhat homogenous, relatively safe product at the moment in the way that we deliver aged care. But the two things that are massively changing, to your point, is that the number of humans available to deliver services and pay for them, taxpayers, is shrinking. So the one certainty that we know is we can't keep doing it that way. And so in the future, we're going to have to spend more of our money going into this, Danny. Adam's going to have to spend all his money by the time he goes in. And nothing drives consumer choice faster than having to pay for stuff. So that's the first part. The second part is the nature of the people themselves. So we kind of look at the people that we are supporting at the moment as being frugal and grateful, and they get their direct care costs almost 100% funded by the taxpayer. So there's a reason to be grateful. And their history, the builder generation's history, is relatively modest. And so they've seen the world change around them, but they've been through, many of them, a couple of world wars and a depression, and they've been somewhat happy to fit into the jam jars of funding that we make available for them. And they're cool with that. I think the next generation of consumers, my folks, are the architects of consumer choice, and they cannot be told what they can and can't do with their money. And they're going to be super engaged in making sure that the providers are focused on the things that they love and not the disability that brings them to them. So that, I think, the combination of those two things, we can't afford to subsidize people who don't need subsidies, and those people are not going to enjoy a homogenous, heavily subsidized and rationed service. That's also so exciting. It has to break now. It's got to change now.
How do we, in that equation, Cam, how do we make sure that the funds coming into the system do get used to drive innovation and solutions and all these wonderful things, and it doesn't get wasted? Because I think that's a big thing when I speak to family and friends and people about aged care and government spending is, especially at the moment, I think with cost of living pressures, people bring up to me, how do we make sure, maybe not in such nice ways, but people say, how do we make sure money's not getting wasted out there? So how do you think we deal with that?
In terms of the subsidies, the amount of subsidies that are going towards older people in care?
Yeah, and just ensuring that there's selection and availability out there, and that there are, it's not just, I think from the different point of view, so kind of taking the other point of view, is that I guess there's a risk that a whole bunch of money comes in, but we don't see these innovations, we don't see these exciting things. I know that's probably a very one-sided view to look at, but I'm just saying, playing devil's advocate, how do we ensure that if there's a flush of money, we don't just get kind of like a very level, increase where we could end up with, an unhappy next generation with not great care? That is a possibility.
Yes, well, it's a probability if we don't open up the caps on means tested care fees, because when your taxpayer base shrinks, and then it becomes the next generations, Y and Z, who at the moment would find it very difficult to buy a home. When you put more and more pressure on those people to subsidize people who control about half of the country's wealth, who won't be grateful for receiving services that are rationed and under-resourced because we're squeezing a reduced base, then yes, you're going to get that. And unfortunately, Adam, we're going to get that for the next little bit. So there's some nice markers in there that can help us. So having an independent pricing authority, providing objective analysis of what it costs to be able to deliver services is a good way of doing it. They don't have to take on the authorities' recommendations as they do the acute sector, but it's more difficult politically for the politicians to duck and weave about, whether they're appropriately funding it. So that's good. But at the point that those numbers come up and we have more Fair Work decisions as we have a couple of weeks ago, then all of a sudden, the levy will burst. And so I think that will happen naturally. In the longer term, you are going to continue to have to ration the services. And the reason that it's going to happen that way is because we decided to keep the same aged care system that we had before the Royal Commission. So the Royal Commission said, recommendation 25 said, we need a new system. We need to move away from a ration system into an entitlement-based system like Medicare or NDIS, so that you actually get the services based on your need. And they made the decision not to do that. The decision was, we're going to keep on rationing them out based on what we can afford. So the new Act, or the exposure draft for the new Act, is pretty silent on the equity of access issues that you just raised. So what is going to happen in reality is, while we have an uninformed public about what it is that happens on a ration system, and we're pretending that we've got a new system and a new Act is attaching to a new system rather than really just a new Act on the old system, is we're going to have people missing out. And so you're already seeing on the home care side of things that people getting access to the home care support that they need at the right level is already starting to bleed. And our ability to be able to deliver those services while they're underfunded is falling behind need as well. So that is unfortunate, but in a ration system, you'll continue to get that. So some of the most exciting opportunities are outside of that. So if realistically we looked at my folks and said, look, they're probably not going to get the level of support that they need at home in the first instance, then they have the capacity to do much more. It's that part of the system moving forward where the opportunity for innovation is really, really exciting. And we don't have to make it all up and make sure we don't waste money, as you put it. There are countries that have been operating on a use of pay model for a longer period of time. But we're going to go through a bit of a transition period where we're going to make some mistakes and it's not going to kind of work. But by the time, we get to 2035, I think we'll have the basis of some really great systems. And I think we will have reduced the over subsidization of people who don't need subsidies. We're going to be in that creative, innovative sort of space. And I think there'll be less providers in the market delivering.
It does seem like an exciting, you can either see it as a crisis or an opportunity, but an exciting situation where the user dictates their expectations and the quality, because you can either ration things or price them. So the people who can afford it will say, this is what I want. And if you don't provide it, I'll go to people down the road, and then they'll all compete for that money. And then the people at the lower end of the economic spectrum, that burden will be lifted surely by the people who are paying.
Absolutely, because I think if we appropriately tax those that can afford to pay themselves, then we provide a much better safety net for those that can't. But while we continue to play political games about the value of our family home, the safety net is too wide, and that puts too many of us eligible for support when we don't need it. And then the depth of the supports are greater than it needs to be. And when we adjust that, and we will adjust that through whether X, Y, and Z become more involved and engaged in having to pay for this stuff, I think we'll see that we'll get much better at adjusting the safety net out of necessity and making sure that we better direct those people, that support to people with financial disadvantage, social disadvantage, regional, remote, Indigenous, and other areas where it's really better focused. I think there's a slight difference. We've got to be careful here, but I think there's also a bit of a slight difference in social attitudes as well, and maybe a movement away from productivity and wealth generation that will also accompany younger generations, focusing their hard-earned taxpayer dollars just on those that really, really need it. So if you're not delivering a benevolent service, or if you're not in need of a benevolent service, I think your access to subsidies for political reasons is going to be harder, and that's good.
From a provider perspective, Cam, there's a lot of things for them to navigate. It's exciting, but there's a lot of stuff to navigate. Straight away comes to mind for me is workforce issues, which is just this ongoing pain for the industry to try to solve. How are you advising your clients, or how would you be navigating the current situation with a view on that kind of future change? Because I think it's the first time I've heard this changeover period be described, and that makes it very clear for me. I always kind of wondered, it's not just going to be one day where we go from here to here. So you describing that changeover period kind of clears it up for me. But how would you be navigating that as a provider?
In relation to workforce or generally?
I think generally, I just mean workforce is a compounding factor on everything happening. It's probably one of the biggest compounding factors, at least being discussed out there at the moment. I know change standards, the enforced standards, the reinforced standards are coming in. So there's a lot going on. I think you said the providers might have a little bit of a chance to, the waters have steadied for the moment. How do you think they prepare for this next couple of years?
Yeah, well, I think Danny was referring to the ostriches presentation. So we basically looking at how different organizations respond to these sort of situations. And ostriches are important because most of us are ostriches. And ostriches are organizations that, because of all of the reform fatigue and the change fatigue that we've just talked about, or just fear of the uncertainty of the future, just their threat response is just to stop. And they'll move when there's a change in legislation, or they see their competitors moving a lot, or there's changes in the property market, or those sorts of things. But generally speaking, they are tending to stand still. And they're the ones that are really at risk, because their customers are about to change quite considerably from people that are frugal and are grateful to, the architects of consumer choice who are not grateful. And so your whole customer base is starting to change. And so ostriches are those that will hang around and just try and do the same thing, and hang on while the world shifts underneath them. And so if they've got strong balance sheets, their demise will probably be quite slow. It'll be death by 1,000 cuts. The losers, I think, are those organizations that see this huge surge in demand for what it is that they do, and they keep building today's models at numbers that meet that huge demand to find that they're buying it. So, and for those organizations, their demise will be quick, sometimes regardless of how strong their balance sheet, because they'll invest heavily in capital that won't be utilized or not utilized for what they thought it would be. And the advice that we give clients is to create their own vision of what they think the world will look like in 10 years or 20 years. And as I say, that there'll be mistakes in our vision of where things are, but for them to say, I disagree with that, or agree with that, or I think this will be shaped, whatever it is, to say, look, this is what I think the world will look like in 10 or 20 years. And this is the bit that I think fits nicely for us. And then to say, well, what do we look like now? What would we need to change to get into that position? And then what is our strategy to enable us to do it? And how do we get our board and executive and the whole team on the ground engaged in us reaching that mission? And don't do it in fluffy, cuddly words around, collaboration and respect and all of that sort of stuff. What is it that you want to do in the future? And for some of our clients, they've looked at that bit and they've said, you know what, we don't want to be in that future.
Right.
And that then becomes their strategy. Or we don't want this part of our business to be in the future, and they will go on to divest, and they might look to expand in other areas. Some of them will get out altogether. But I would say in 10 years' time, even if the demand for the services are doubling, I think the number of providers participating will be much less, particularly in the residential aged care space. Home care is maybe going to be a little bit different, but I think you're actually going to get a smaller number of larger providers in certain areas. Today, we're all thinking we're going to be those larger providers and we'll grow and grow and grow and grow. But that's not technically possible. I think the reality is a lot of organizations will either make the choice to go, or they'll go because they were the ostriches and didn't move until they depleted their cash reserves, or they'll go because you've been presented to my team from receivers or banks who can't get their money back. And so I think that sort of changing dynamic will also shape a different sector. I think having a smaller number of providers is also good for industry. I think having such thin ownership across aged care in Australia and retirement living in Australia makes it more difficult to strongly lobby government. And I think because government is a major funder for a lot of the interest groups, it's really important for providers to have a really strong voice that's independent of government. And I think we'll get that over the next 10 years.
Do you find, Cam, that people are receptive to the change that's coming through with the with how the demographic that requires aged care? Are there more ostriches than not?
Yes, I think in my experience in business generally, Danny, I usually find that most of us are ostriches. I find this daunting. Like I'm really excited about it, but in the last 30 years, I have to be honest and say that I kind of have the blinkers on myself. The last sort of 20 or 30 years, we've been taking the best of everything that we've learned and trying to incorporate that into making the next village or the next nursing home or home care service the best that it can be. But largely we've been using our history, and we work overseas, so we can bring bits of that as well. But now we have to let go of some of that. For many of us, 20 years or 30 years of experience or whatever it is that we've got, that can be a real shackle, because we need to think about why we do it that way. when someone new comes into this place, we really encourage them to ask dumb questions, because they're not dumb questions. They're questions because they're asking it in the context of their parents, or maybe in the context of themselves. And I have to shut myself up when I go, well, we do it that way because the funding program works in this thing. You capture that. They see the woods from the trees for a short period of time. And so I think it's challenging for me too. I've got to let go of the stuff that I'd learned in the past. I had to do that in 2008 when I started working in New Zealand, because they were miles ahead of us already. So I had to let go of some of that stuff that I'd picked up. But I'm still, a little bit contained into history. And so it's not, I'm really excited, but I've got to treat it with respect too, because it's daunting, and we're making projections about the future that none of us will be exactly right on. And so I love it when I go to strategy sessions and I'm challenged, and I listen to people who are taking it from a different perspective. And particularly when I talk to the more senior baby boomers that are executives or part of my team, I love listening to them and getting their perspectives, because they're the ones that are most important. And I've never had to think about those things before. I've been dealing with grateful people who have had no choice but to slot into those jam jars. No more.
How do you get away with, not get away with it, but you're probably the only person that I've heard speak so candidly about boomers, Cam. How do you get away with that? I think it's probably, I know you got such a good way of coming across, but I reckon I'd get smashed down if I spoke like that.
Well, I'm sort of close myself, and my folks are and Australia's a bit different, right? Because when you look at the rest of the world and you talk about boomers, it's normally 9 months after the end of World War II. You get that first spike, and then it goes up. Actually, with Australia, our birth rates were up in the late 30s. So even though we talk about the boomers turning 80 shortly, in fact, our baby boom is a little bit earlier. We had a period of great prosperity in Australia in the late 30s. So we've got an earlier baby boomer generation. And that includes my folks that have some of these characteristics. And I think you can get away with it, because I reckon they're one of the coolest generations. You think about what they've come out of. So they've had these builder parents who, are frugal and grateful and all those things. But their means have been relatively modest. And through prosperity, or, what happens at the end of a major conflict, the baby boomers have then built and created this world that we live in. And so when you talk about people being entitled, the baby boomers will tell you that they're entitled to be entitled, because they've got us to where we are at the moment. We're entitled, particularly your generation now, because you've been born into it and you're just used to being entitled. And so I love talking about these things, because for us, we're going to hang on to our entitlements in the same way that baby boomers do. We believe we're entitled to it because we know no different. They believe they're entitled to do it because they are, and they created it. And so I love talking about this stuff, and I love them having, jumping into the conversation, as you often do, because they're, many of us, them among our workforce are leaders, and getting their perspectives on it, I think, is really cool.
And we're having a laugh about it, but I mean, when I hear that, when I hear the entitlement and that, I really hear that, like, a level of excellence, a level of expectation. I don't always see that as such a negative connotation to that word. So, I like that. I don't normally hear it. So it's kind of, I quite like that.
They're the best generation to be coming through to affect change, because they've got that purchasing power, they've got that history behind them, and the change is going to come from the user up rather than the regulatory framework down.
Yeah.
And that, even phrases like profit motive, profit incentive, it seems to be a dirty word in healthcare, because it brings about the connotation that that means you're going to swindle everyone and cut corners, whereas the way I see it is it's going to drive quality, because if you've got that competition, they'll just go elsewhere. Then they won't stand for it, because they've been through all that stuff.
Yeah, that's like Cam said, hey? Like the previous generation will accept whatever's given, so they're not going to, what is it, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So
you've got that change coming from the user.
Yes, absolutely. You put it beautifully, Danny. That's it. And that's what makes it so cool. I think the bit that we can make, that we can help them to come to, is for them to understand that the tighter they hang on to their entitlement in terms of retaining their money to not invest in their own care, the poorer the quality of their own care will be. And I think we need to take that, can't say selfishness, but our natural entitled nature to try and say, let's use the money that we have to get the best quality of care that we possibly can. At the point that this silly bit of politics continues to go on, when we're pretending that we can afford to do this beyond the taxpayer-based capacity to afford it, the sooner they can interpret that as being a rationed, homogenous standard of service for them, then they should open up and enable them to invest directly in their direct care services. Let's put the money for the people who can't afford it. And honestly, if I'm going to make it to 100, and if my kids are still hanging around waiting for, an inheritance for me when they're in their 70s, I've got bigger problems to deal with. So it's all going, kids.
Yeah. I also like that you called the younger generation snowflakes. You actually used the word snowflakes in a speech.
Millennial snowflakes.
Yeah.
And I got 7 of them, so I'm entitled to use it. But I want.
Actually, I was just going to say, Cam, what are you seeing in New Zealand? Is it much the same, or are there some different points that are interesting happening over there?
Yes, it's really interesting, Adam. So we've just finished our survey of the aged care performance within ARC, which is their RAC, which is their residential aged care. Basically the difference in New Zealand is you don't usually build a nursing home unless you're co-located on a village, and they have much stronger continuum of care between the village and the RAC. And so what's been happening is they invest in residential aged care as a loss leader for the village. So the village is, much more valuable if you're co-located with a RAC that does stuff, delivers services in or offers opportunities for people to go into it. And so that's been working okay, but they had a slowdown in the property market last year, and it's really highlighted how far behind subsidies have got behind the cost of care of delivering services in residential aged care. So they're going through a bit of an adjustment now. They are much more user pay than us. If you've got enough wealth, then you'll pay for virtually all of your aged care services, particularly within residential aged care. About 1/3 of people are entirely self-funded. But we also in New Zealand are now working with the new government, who's really on a big mission to try and get the economy straight. And a lot of that is through cost cutting. So going to them and asking for more subsidies is not going to cut it. So we've got a great opportunity in New Zealand to come to them with some ways in which consumers can invest in their own care, and they can redirect money for the people who need it. So it is a Australasian challenge we've got. They're just probably a little bit more accustomed to paying for stuff themselves.
So do you think we can learn from them? Sounds like they're maybe a little bit ahead in the journey of going in that direction than us.
Yeah, well, you'd never like to say nice things about Kiwis, but they probably are. I think you have to accept it. They probably do have things for us to learn. Their continuum is not perfect, and so the delivery of home care services is still a little bit disjointed, as ours is. So they've still got some areas to move, but their ability to be able to provide quality, flexible services outside of the funding regime is really good. And I think that we can learn from them. I think the thing that I really get a lot out of is it's really nice to know the difference between what people say they want when they're paying for it themselves, and then what they actually end up paying for when they're in service. And so when we do that work in Australia, when we look at user-funded or club fees or whatever it is, we draw on that experience from Kiwis, because they're quite like us in terms of what their expectations are, rather than spending lots of money on a menu of services that were nice ideas but weren't things that people paid for.
What we've been asking our other guests as well is what you see as the future of implementing AI and robotics into aged care.
Well, I'm on the board of IntelliCare, and so IntelliCare is built around providing support for people in nursing homes or at home or in retirement villages. I think we'll just get better and better at that. So even without wearable devices, we're able to, telecare basically creates a bit of a baseline that gives you an average. So it will take Danny and it'll say that his average resting heart rate is this, and his breath rate a minute is this, and it tracks your movement around your room. It kind of works out how often you do things, and then it goes into the next level of detail about how you hydrate, how often you go to the bathroom. And then when you start to deviate from those base rates, it starts to trigger warnings, and then it relates those things. So it says, Danny went to the bathroom 3 times instead of once last night. What does that mean? Well, we also noticed from a sensor on the fridge that he went to the fridge 5 times last night. And so we then make the relationship between that and the fact that, Collingwood played footy the night before, that he was drinking beer watching the footy, and then we've got an expectation. Now, if there wasn't some relation to those things within the baseline, it could be an opportunity for us to pick up a UTI ahead of it, or something else that has gone wrong. Or we could be tracking falls or all of those sorts of things. They're all really good things in terms of independence and keeping us out of aged care. But once we're in aged care, I think those things can be really helpful in terms of then enabling us to use our scarce human resources in a proactive way, rather than being reactive at checking on Danny multiple times at night, or not knowing how to put together information. So I think there's great potential for AI and technology. I don't think by 2035 we're going to have robots running around doing things that humans can do at the moment. I hope I'm wrong on that, but I think one of the biggest limitations to home care services is there are too many people who will require them and not enough humans that are able to deliver it. We can be more proactive by using AI and assistive technology, but our ability to be able to physically execute with the number of humans we have is going to mean that we'll continue to need residential aged care, and more retirement villages will deliver care services.
You've made me more excited about aged care than anyone for a little while. What's the thing that makes you most excited about the kind of short to medium term future of aged care and your involvement in it?
I think it's just that imagining, Adam. I think it's what we've been talking about today, is to imagine what that future looks like with no certainty, with no precedent, and to try and imagine that, and then to have discussions like this and have people challenge what my imaginings are and refine it and get it better. And I just love doing that at the moment. I just think that's the most exciting thing. When I was younger and I looked at aged care as being an exciting opportunity, I was thinking about the numbers. I was thinking about the huge number of people that would come through in this next 10-year period. And that was exciting as it was. And, let's face it, I'm a chartered accountant, so my baseline of excitement is relatively low. But that was wrong. In fact, what's exciting is the characteristics, the nature of those people that will come through the system. That very exciting, entitled, powerful baby boomer generation. That's the stuff that's really exciting. What's daunting is that there's so many of them. Both of those things are really, really exciting. So that's what I'm most looking forward to. How do we gear up? How do we get ready for it? And how do we keep the number of ostriches and losers to a minimum?
Well, thanks heaps for your time, Cam. I really appreciate your time. I'm always learning from you for sure. Your insight into the industry is definitely special, in my opinion. Your view across Australia and New Zealand is something that's a bit unique, and I think we can learn a lot from your experience and the things you're seeing out there. And yeah, just thank you for coming on. Really, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And yeah, I'd love to have you on again.
And I'd love to do that. Thanks so much, Adam, Danny. That was really good fun.
Thank you.
Thanks heaps, Cam.
Cheers.